My sister refused to lend me $800 when I was at my lowest point, and now she's asking for my help. My name's Emily, and this is the story of how everything fell apart between me and my sister, Rebecca. For as long as I can remember, Rebecca and I have been polar opposites. She's the polished, high-achieving one, the golden child in our parents' eyes. She was the top student, the captain of her high school tennis team, and seemingly flawless. Meanwhile, I was the messy one, the dreamer who struggled to find her place. Even as adults, the gap between us never really narrowed. Rebecca thrives on discipline, structure, and precision, while I'm the one learning through trial and error, making mistakes along the way. Though we've never been particularly close, I always thought that in a crisis, we'd have each other's backs. I was wrong. Everything began to crumble in 2016 when my life hit rock bottom. I was working for a small marketing firm in Springfield. It wasn't my dream job, but the paycheck was enough to cover my expenses and provide a little breathing room. After 2 years there, I appreciated the stability, even if the work wasn't fulfilling. Then, out of the blue, the company shut down. No warning, no severance, no safety net, just gone. I'll never forget the moment my manager called me into her office. She looked pale, avoiding eye contact as she informed me that the company was closing, and we'd receive our final paychecks in 2 weeks. I walked out, dazed, clutching a box of my belongings, feeling like my entire world had just collapsed. Initially, I thought I'd bounce back quickly. I'd been through tough times before, and I believed this would be no different. But as days turned into weeks, panic set in. I applied for everything I could find. Temp jobs, retail work, freelance gigs, but Springfield's job market was stagnant. Rejection after rejection piled up. By the second week, my savings were gone, and rent was due in less than 10 days. I had no backup plan, no inheritance to fall back on, and no partner to share the burden. It felt like the walls were closing in, leaving me breathless. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, losing my apartment, sleeping on someone's couch, if anyone would even take me in, or worse, ending up in a shelter. In that desperation, I realized I had only one option left: asking Rebecca for help. Admitting I needed her was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Rebecca isn't heartless, but she's inflexible. To her, life is simple. You work hard, save money, and never ask for help. Growing up, she was quick to lecture me about my choices, whether it was my messy room or my decision to major in English instead of something practical. Asking her for financial help felt like walking into court, where she'd be the judge, and I'd already be found guilty. I sat on my couch for hours, staring at my phone, my pride screaming not to call. But my fear of losing my home outweighed my pride. Finally, I dialed her number. She answered on the third ring, her tone brisk and businesslike. "What's up, Emily? I'm busy." My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak. "Hey, Becca. I wouldn't call if it wasn't important. I lost my job. The company shut down a few weeks ago, and I've been trying to get by, but I'm struggling. I need your help." Her voice didn't change. "What kind of help?" I swallowed hard, my voice trembling. "I need $800 to cover my rent until I can find a job. It's not a handout. I'll pay you back as soon as I can." There was a long silence. For a moment, I thought she might consider it, calculating how to help without disrupting her orderly life. But when she finally spoke, her words were icy. "No." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "What?" "No, Emily. I don't lend money to family. It's a rule Todd and I have. It's not personal. Not personal." That's how she framed it, as if I were a stranger asking for a loan. I begged her to reconsider, my voice breaking. "Becca, please. I'm not asking for much. Just enough to get through this month. I swear I'll pay you back." She cut me off. "I'm sorry, but I can't. It's my policy." Then she hung up. I sat there, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face as her words echoed in my mind. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what her refusal meant. I wasn't some distant relative or casual acquaintance. I was her sister, and she'd shut the door on me without hesitation. That night, I cried until I was drained. The rejection wasn't just financial. It symbolized the truth about our relationship. I'd always believed family stood by each other in hard times. Rebecca's cold response shattered that belief. She didn't even offer alternatives. No, "Let me ask Todd." No, "I can help with groceries." Or, "I'll help you job hunt." Just a flat no. The following days were a blur of anger and heartbreak. I replayed the conversation over and over, wondering if I'd said the wrong thing or been too emotional. But deep down, I knew the truth. She didn't care. Rebecca didn't care that her sister was drowning. In that moment, I realized I was truly alone. Somehow, I'd have to figure it out on my own. The first thing I did was take a hard look around my apartment and make a list of items I could sell. My old gaming console was the first to go. Although I hadn't used it much recently, it had been a gift from a dear friend, and selling it felt like letting go of a cherished memory. But I couldn't afford to cling to sentimentality. Next, I listed a decent pair of headphones, an old camera, and even my collection of vintage records. Each item I put up for sale felt like parting with a piece of myself, but I reminded myself that survival took priority. Over the following days, I made countless trips to the post office, shipping out the items I sold on online marketplaces. By the end, I had managed to gather about $300. It wasn't nearly enough. The thought of pawning my laptop crossed my mind more than once, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. That laptop was my lifeline, my only tool for job hunting, submitting applications, and staying connected to the outside world. Without it, I'd be completely lost. As I packed up the last of the items I'd sold, I couldn't help but think about Rebecca. Her immaculate home, her weekly Pilates sessions, and her husband Todd's shiny new car seemed like a world apart from my reality. She had the kind of life where $800 would barely make a dent, yet she had refused to help me. I tried not to let the bitterness consume me, but it was impossible not to feel the sting of injustice. Desperation forced me to set aside my pride once again, this time with my friends. Asking them for help felt different than asking Rebecca. With Rebecca, it was humiliating because I knew she'd judge me. With my friends, it was uncomfortable because I hated being a burden. Still, I had no other choice. I reached out to my closest friends, Melissa and Jake, and explained my situation. I didn't outright ask for money. I just shared what I was going through, hoping they might offer. To my surprise, they did. Melissa sent me $150, apologizing that it couldn't be more, while Jake offered $100. It wasn't a large amount, but it was something. More importantly, their support gave me a much-needed emotional lift. They didn't make me feel like a failure for asking. Melissa even told me I could stay on her couch if things got worse, and that small gesture brought me to tears. Meanwhile, I kept applying for any job I could find. Retail, temp work, dog walking, even cleaning jobs. I was no longer picky. My days became a relentless cycle of scouring job boards, sending out resumes, and waiting for responses that rarely came. When I did land an interview, rejection emails followed within days, sometimes hours. It was devastating, but I didn't have the luxury of giving up. One day, as I was taking out the trash, I ran into Mrs. Harrison, my elderly neighbor. She was the kind of person who always had something kind to say. I must have looked as stressed as I felt because she stopped me, concern in her eyes. "You're carrying a lot on your shoulders, aren't you, dear?" she said. Before I knew it, I was pouring out my heart to her. About losing my job, Rebecca's rejection, and how I was barely hanging on. Mrs. Harrison didn't offer money or solutions, but she listened. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone genuinely cared. That conversation sparked a glimmer of hope, reminding me that not everyone was as unfeeling as Rebecca. Despite these small victories, the money from friends, the kind words from Mrs. Harrison, the reality of my situation remained unchanged. Rent day loomed closer, and I was still short. The thought of calling Rebecca again briefly crossed my mind, but my pride wouldn't let me. She had made her position clear, and I wasn't going to beg her a second time. Instead, I resorted to doing things I'd never imagined. I picked up odd jobs wherever I could, walking neighbors' dogs, assembling furniture for a friend's acquaintance, and babysitting for a family down the street. None of these gigs paid much, but every bit helped. By the time rent day arrived, I'd managed to scrape together just enough to cover it. As I handed my landlord the check, my hands trembled. While I was relieved to avoid eviction, the ordeal had left me drained. I knew I couldn't keep living this way, scrambling every month just to keep a roof over my head. Something had to change. Looking back, those weeks were some of the hardest of my life, but they also taught me an important lesson. When pushed to the edge, I could survive on my own. It wasn't easy and came at a cost, selling my possessions, leaning on friends, and losing sleep, but I made it through. What hurt the most, though, was Rebecca's silence after that phone call. She didn't check in, not a single text, call, or even a simple, "How are you holding up?" It was as though I didn't exist to her. I wasn't expecting her to change her mind and send me the money, but a message to see if I was okay wouldn't have cost her anything. Her indifference cut deeper than her refusal. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about what it symbolized. Rebecca had shown me exactly where I stood in her life, and it wasn't where I thought I'd be. I wasn't her sister in any meaningful sense, just someone she happened to share DNA with, someone she could conveniently ignore. By the time I finally landed a small temp job a few weeks later, I was a changed person. I was still struggling, but I had developed a kind of emotional armor. I kept reminding myself that I didn't need Rebecca or anyone else to rescue me. I'd pull through on my own, just as I always had. What I didn't realize back then was how her refusal would forever alter our relationship. This wasn't just a tough period. It marked the beginning of a deeper rift in our family, one that would never completely mend. The months that followed my desperate scramble to cover rent blurred into a haze of hard work, fatigue, and frustration. I managed to keep my apartment, but it was by the skin of my teeth. It felt like I was constantly teetering on the edge of losing everything all over again. Every penny I earned from the odd jobs I took on went directly toward bills, leaving no space for savings or even the smallest luxuries. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but at least I still had a roof over my head. Eventually, my determination paid off. After months of relentless effort, I secured a temporary job as a receptionist at a small insurance company. The pay was far from ideal, but it was consistent. More importantly, it gave me an opportunity to rebuild my life one paycheck at a time. I poured myself into the job, arriving early, staying late, and volunteering for additional responsibilities whenever possible. Within a few months, they offered me a permanent position with a modest pay increase. It wasn't a dream job, but it brought me stability and, for the first time in ages, a sense of relief. Even as my circumstances improved, the silence between Rebecca and me persisted. We had never been the kind of sisters who spoke often, but now the distance felt deliberate. A part of me wanted to reach out and tell her I had made it without her help, but the lingering bitterness kept me from picking up the phone. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. 2 years passed in this way. I focused on myself, crafting a life that, while modest, felt secure. I found joy in small things, walking in the park, discovering a love for cooking, and occasionally taking short trips out of town. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I took pride in building it on my own. Then, one evening in late 2018, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in ages: Rebecca. At first, I thought it must have been a mistake. Rebecca never called me, not even to wish me a happy birthday or check in. My initial instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, her voice was thick with tears, real, messy sobbing, not the delicate crying you see in movies. It was so unlike her that I almost didn't recognize her. "Emily," she managed between sobs. "I didn't know who else to call." Her words hit me like a wave, stirring a mix of emotions. This was the same sister who had turned me away at my lowest point, who had refused to help because it didn't fit her principles. And now she needed me. "What's going on, Rebecca?" I asked cautiously, unsure where this was headed. She took a moment to compose herself before explaining. Her husband, Todd, had been laid off months earlier, and their finances were in shambles. On top of that, her 3-year-old daughter, Lila, my niece, needed a medical procedure that required an upfront payment their insurance wouldn't cover. They needed $11,200, and she was turning to me for help. I sat there, stunned. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 years earlier, I had been in her position, desperate, scared, and out of options, and she had turned her back on me. Now, she expected me to step in and save the day. "We don't have anyone else to turn to." Her voice was thick with desperation, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. I loved Lila. She was innocent in all of this, and didn't deserve to suffer for her parents' choices. But despite my feelings for my niece, I couldn't shake the bitterness. "Rebecca," I said slowly, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." The silence on the other end was deafening. For a moment, I thought she might have hung up, but then she erupted. "How can you say that?" she screamed. "This isn't about me. It's about Lila, your niece. How can you punish an innocent child just to get back at me?" Her words stung, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I'm not punishing anyone, least of all Lila," I replied. "But I can't forget how you treated me when I was in a similar situation. You set the terms for our relationship, Rebecca. I'm just following them." "You're being petty," she shot back. "Vindictive and selfish, that's what you are." The argument spiraled out of control, her accusations coming fast and furious. She called me heartless, accused me of holding a grudge, and even suggested I was jealous of her life. I wanted to laugh at that. Jealous of what? The shiny facade hiding all her problems? But I didn't. Instead, I told her the truth. "This isn't about jealousy, Rebecca," I said firmly. "It's about boundaries. 2 years ago, I begged you for help, and you slammed the door in my face. Now you're asking me to do what you couldn't. Do you see how unfair that is?" She didn't, or maybe she refused to. "You're heartless," she spat before hanging up. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. Part of me felt sick, knowing Lila might bear the brunt of our broken relationship. But another part of me felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time in years, I had stood my ground against Rebecca. I had set a boundary and kept to it, even though it hurt. That phone call marked a significant turning point, not only in my relationship with Rebecca, but also in how I valued myself. I realized I was no longer the person who had sobbed on the phone 2 years earlier, begging for assistance. I had learned to rely on myself, and I wasn't about to let Rebecca or anyone else take that from me. What I didn't know was that the fallout from that conversation was only just beginning. Rebecca was not one to let things slide quietly, and before long, the rest of the family would be dragged into our conflict. For the moment, though, I allowed myself to feel a small sense of pride. I had chosen peace for myself, even though it came at a price. I wish I could say the drama ended when Rebecca hung up, but that would have been far too easy. Just a few hours after our conversation, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mom. "Emily, what's going on?" she asked, her voice tense. "Rebecca just called, and she's a wreck. She said you refused to help Lila. How could you do that?" And there it was. Rebecca hadn't wasted any time spinning her version of the story. I could already picture her in my parents' living room, crying into my mom's arms while portraying me as some kind of heartless villain. "It's not that simple, Mom," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "Did she tell you what happened 2 years ago? When I was on the verge of losing my apartment and begged her for $800, she didn't even consider helping me. Now, she expects me to come to her rescue?" "That was different," Mom replied quickly. "She didn't have a child to think about back then. This is about Lila, Emily. She's your niece, and she's innocent in all of this." "I know that," I said, feeling my frustration rising. "And I love Lila, but Rebecca is the one who set the rules for how our relationship works. She made it clear that family doesn't help each other during tough times. I'm just following the example she set." Mom let out a heavy sigh. "I understand you're upset, but holding on to this grudge doesn't help anyone. Lila needs you. Can't you let go of the past just this once?" Talking to her felt like hitting a wall. No matter how much I explained, Mom couldn't or wouldn't see things from my perspective. To her, this wasn't about Rebecca's hypocrisy or the years of tension between us. It was about Lila. And in her eyes, I was the bad guy for not stepping up. The calls didn't stop there. The next day, my dad called, and his voice was filled with disappointment. "Emily, I raised you better than this," he said. "Family is family. You don't turn your back on them no matter what." "Dad, I didn't turn my back on her," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She turned her back on me when I needed her. And now she's lying to everyone about what's really happening." "What do you mean?" he asked, sounding skeptical. I hesitated, unsure whether to say more, but the frustration of being painted as the villain pushed me to continue. "She told me the money was for Lila's medical bills," I said. "But something about her story doesn't add up." Dad was quiet for a moment before finally saying, "You need to let this go, Emily. Holding on to this bitterness will only hurt you in the end." I hung up the phone, feeling utterly drained. It wasn't just the pressure from my parents, it was the realization that no one seemed to care about my side of the story. To them, Rebecca was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and I was the difficult one, the one who was always falling short. Rebecca wasn't done either. Over the next few days, she bombarded me with texts. One moment, she was pleading with me to reconsider, promising to pay me back as soon as possible. The next, she was calling me selfish and spiteful. "You're lucky to be in a position to help," one message read. "You don't know what it's like to struggle." That one nearly made me throw my phone across the room. Did she really think I didn't know what it was like to struggle? Had she completely forgotten about the time I had cried to her on the phone, terrified of losing my home? It became clear that Rebecca wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. She even tried to involve other family members. One morning, I woke up to a flood of texts from cousins, aunts, and even a few family friends. They all echoed the same sentiment. How could you let your niece suffer? Most of them didn't know the full story, of course. Rebecca had likely given them a cleaned-up version of events, conveniently leaving out the part where she had refused to help me when I needed her. I didn't have the energy to argue with all of them, so I muted the group chat and focused on keeping calm. But the final straw came when Rebecca escalated things even further. She showed up at our parents' house with Lila in tow, using her as a prop in her guilt campaign. Later that day, Mom called me again, her voice trembling. "Emily, Lila was here today, she said. She doesn't understand why her aunt won't help her mommy. She kept asking why you don't love her. My blood boiled. I knew Rebecca was manipulative, but using her own child to pull at my emotions was a new low. Mom, that's not fair, I said, my voice shaking. Lila doesn't deserve to be dragged into this. Rebecca is the one making this messy, not me. Mom didn't reply, but it was clear she was still on Rebecca's side. The guilt weighed on me, but I knew I couldn't give in. If I caved now, it would only reinforce Rebecca's belief that she could manipulate me whenever it suited her. Determined, I resolved to take back control of the situation. I chose to confront the issue directly, sending a detailed message to the family group chat to set the record straight. Hi everyone, I began. I want to explain what's been happening because there seems to be some confusion. 2 years ago, I was in a tough position and reached out to Rebecca for help. I was about to lose my apartment and asked to borrow $800. She declined, which was her choice, and I respected that even though it hurt. Recently, Rebecca requested $1,200, saying it was for Lila's medical expenses. I love my niece and would never want her to suffer, but I've learned that not all of the money was actually for medical purposes. I can't support being manipulated, and I won't provide money without honesty. I hope you can all understand where I'm coming from. After hitting send, I muted the chat and went for a walk to escape the anxiety of waiting for responses and to clear my head. By the time I returned, there were over 50 new messages. Most were from Rebecca, who was clearly furious, but a few came from cousins privately praising my bravery. I knew, though, that this was far from over. Rebecca wasn't going to back down, and my parents wouldn't change their stance overnight. Yet, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd made progress toward regaining my peace. Letting go of the guilt wasn't easy, and standing firm had its own kind of pain, but one thing was clear. I wouldn't let Rebecca's manipulations dictate my life anymore. I deserved better than that. After sending the message, I braced myself for the aftermath, and Rebecca didn't disappoint. The next morning, my phone was inundated with her texts. They ranged from desperate appeals for me to reconsider to lengthy rants accusing me of tearing the family apart. "You've always been jealous of me," one message read. "That's why you're doing this. To hurt me because you can't stand that I've built a better life than you." I wanted to respond, to call her out for her lies and manipulation, but I held back. Engaging with her would only escalate the situation, and I didn't have the energy for another round of accusations. Instead, I forwarded a screenshot of her most outrageous message to my parents, along with proof that her claims about Lila's medical expenses weren't entirely true. The day before, I had called the hospital Rebecca mentioned to inquire about their payment policies. They were polite, but firm in stating there was no record of a patient named Lila scheduled for any procedure. This confirmed my suspicions that Rebecca had exaggerated or fabricated parts of her story to guilt me. When I shared this evidence with my parents, my mom seemed relieved. "I had a feeling there was more to this," she admitted quietly. My dad, however, was livid. "Why didn't she just tell us the truth?" he demanded. "Why go to such lengths to manipulate everyone?" "I don't know, Dad," I replied, "but this is exactly why I couldn't just hand over the money. If she lied about this, who knows what else she's hiding?" For the first time in weeks, it felt like my parents were beginning to see my side, though the situation was no less difficult. Rebecca continued to bombard me with angry texts, alternating between blaming me for her problems and accusing me of abandoning Lila. Before long, she began involving extended family, hoping to turn them against me. One evening, I received a call from Aunt Clara. "Emily, I just got off the phone with Rebecca," she said cautiously. "She's saying some pretty harsh things about you. Are you okay?" I appreciated her concern, but was tired of constantly defending myself. "Aunt Clara, I'm fine," I said. "Rebecca's upset because I won't give her money, but she's not being honest about the full story. I'm just trying to protect myself." "I thought as much," Aunt Clara replied. "She's always had a flair for the dramatic. Don't let her get to you, sweetheart." Her support meant more than I could express. While many family members stayed neutral or sided with Rebecca, knowing that a few believed me was a small comfort. Despite the ongoing drama, I realized I needed to prioritize my well-being. Rebecca's endless messages were draining, and every phone call from my parents felt like another wave of guilt. Eventually, I decided enough was enough. I blocked Rebecca's number and muted the group chat entirely. Before doing so, I sent her a final message. "Rebecca, I love Lila, and I'll always be here for her if she truly needs me. But I can't keep going through this with you. Your behavior has been hurtful, and I need to protect my peace. I hope one day we can rebuild our relationship, but for now, I need space. Please respect that." I didn't expect her to reply, and she didn't. Blocking her felt extreme, but it was the only way I could move forward without being dragged back into the chaos. With Rebecca out of the picture, the tension with my parents gradually began to ease. Although they weren't thrilled with the situation, they seemed to accept that my decision was final. I had a long conversation with my mom, where I explained how Rebecca's refusal to help me 2 years ago had influenced my choice. "I'm not trying to be petty or vindictive," I told her. "I just can't allow myself to be manipulated again. Rebecca's actions have consequences, and she needs to take responsibility for them." Mom sighed, her voice heavy with emotion. "I understand, Emily. I just wish things were different." "So do I admitted. "But this is the reality we're in, and I have to do what's best for me." Over the following weeks, I began to feel a sense of relief. The family tension began to settle, with my parents mentioning Rebecca less frequently and fewer updates coming from extended relatives. It seemed like everyone was either moving on or pretending to. Despite the calmer atmosphere, I couldn't stop thinking about Lila. She was just a child, entirely innocent in this mess. She didn't deserve to be caught between her mother's schemes and my decision to stand firm. To show her that I still cared, I put together a small care package filled with toys, books, and a handwritten note. "Dear Lila," I wrote, "I love you so much, and will always be here for you. I hope you enjoy these gifts. Love, Aunt Emily." I sent the package to my parents, asking them to deliver it to Lila without involving Rebecca. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was my way of letting Lila know she hadn't been forgotten. As the months went by, Rebecca occupied my thoughts less and less. The bitterness and pain that had once overwhelmed me began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm. I knew I had made the right decision by standing firm, even if it meant severing the fragile bond I had shared with my sister. One unexpected bright spot was the encouragement I received from some of my cousins. After my message in the group chat, a few reached out privately to express their support. "I've always thought Rebecca acted entitled," one cousin wrote, "but no one ever called her out. Good for you for standing your ground." Their words meant more to me than they probably realized. For so long, I had felt like the family outcast, always falling short of Rebecca's image of perfection. Knowing that others saw through her facade reassured me that I wasn't alone. Eventually, I reached a point where I could think about Rebecca without the familiar knot of anger tightening in my stomach. While I still didn't trust her, and doubted I ever would, I no longer felt consumed by the situation. I had found peace, not because the conflict had been resolved, but because I chose to prioritize my own well-being. As for Rebecca, who knows what the future might hold? Perhaps one day we'll find a way to rebuild our relationship. For now, though, I'm content to keep my distance. Life is too short to remain entangled in someone else's toxicity. If this experience has taught me anything, it's that peace is invaluable. No matter how much I love my family, I'm not willing to give it up for anyone, not even my sister.